Welcome to the Veterans History Project, a project in partnership with the Library of Congress. Today is April 22nd, 2003, and we're at the Warhawk Air Museum in Nampa, Idaho. My name is Barry Hill, and our cameraman is Tim Peterson. Our special guest is Chet, a veteran of the U.S. Army Air Corps in World War II. Welcome, Chet.
Thank you.
Chet, thanks for being here today to share your story with us. Will you please give us your full name, address, and birth date?
Chester A. Bowers, informally Chet. Birth date is October 29, 1919, Council Bluffs, Iowa.
Chet, take us back to the early days. Did you spend all your time in Council Bluffs?
My early childhood, of course, and through high school was spent in Council Bluffs before I went to the University of Nebraska, graduating in 1942, but I'd like to digress and go back to my boyhood, if that's acceptable.
That's great.
We were a kind of a generation that came upon this war purely by chance, but uniquely we were fitted to probably carry this nasty business out. For instance, when I was a kid, an early teen, junior, sophomore, high school, we were blessed with a real affluent lifestyle. My dad had the Ford agency in Council Bluffs, Iowa, and had been very successful. And we had a big white brick home up in the Walnut Hills above Council Bluffs, Iowa, which was Fort Caneville. That's where Lewis and Clark went up the Missouri, past what became Omaha on the other side of the river, and Council Bluffs on the east side. But anyway, we were raised at that time. I had everything one day, and the Great Depression came along about in the mid-30s. And I'll never forget, I experienced the loss of a lot of my best possessions. We lost our house, we lost Dad's business, and we were literally from riches to rags in about a period of a week or two, which is a shock for most people. As a kid, I was carrying newspapers, I had one other job, and like a lot of kids at that age group and in that particular piece of geography, we all had guns. We knew how to use them. I don't recall a gun ever being used as a bad gun. I don't recall anything criminally happening as a result of one of our students having a gun or a knife. As I said, every kid in school hunted and fished, and I ran a trap line, which I'd never consider now because of the cruel aspects of it. But anyway, we had a great time as kids in that period of time. We had sandlot football, we had sandlot baseball, basketball, and another blessed friend of mine, George Wiseman, who's dead. He was half a Cherokee Indian, and we ran a trap line, and we ran it on a creek. So we found that skating, strap skates, was a good way to cover that creek. And we started that skating. I'd run it one day, George would run the next. We alternated. We caught civet cats, skunks, occasional raccoon, and we sold the pelts for 50 or 75 cents, which was pretty good money in those days. But anyway, in the process of skating up and down the creek, we taught ourselves how to play ice hockey. And we used tin cans and just tree boughs at first, and then as more kids got interested, and we'd get down there, we actually had hockey sticks and pucks. So it was quite a game I've always loved ever since. On that same creek, I'll give you a little short narrative of childhood experience on the trap line. I came one morning, it was an October morning or somewhere in there in the fall, and it was rainy, cold, wet, and I had a yellow slicker on. And I had a civet cat in my first trap. And I tried to issue the coup de grace quickly and gracefully, but I missed, and the skunk hit me full on. And I mean, at close range, I caught the full blast before I finally put him out. Anyway, I didn't have time to change clothes. So I went to school, Pierce Grade School, which was an old brick building, 3 stories, The top floor was always about 100 degrees. I don't know why. The teachers must have all been anemic. But anyway, I walked into that third floor classroom, and it wasn't 10 seconds before 2 or 3 kids said, "I smell a skunk." And the teacher said, "Has anyone here been in contact with a skunk this morning?" And I said, "I have." She says, "Would you please come here right a minute?" And she wrote me a note and sent me home with admonition that I should never come to that class again in that condition. Well, it was thick. It was so the smell was so heavy, I think some of those kids actually got sick. But that was my first experience with the skunk. I had 2 more later. But anyway, we lived that kind of life. We were very independent of adults. We did almost everything without supervision, and we really enjoyed it. We didn't have time for boredom. We didn't have time to worry about what we were missing in this life. We were pretty well enjoying what we had, even though there was a hell of a depression on. As a result, and in one other experience, I was working at the service station. Dad had leased a Shell station where he pumped gas for 17 cents a gallon in the old tank. You fill it up to 10. If it took 10, or a guy wanted 5, you drained it down to 5. If it was a 20-gallon big car, you had to pump it up twice. But it was a tough job in the winter, changing tire chains for nothing, and all the free service that went with that big gas sale. But on Saturdays, Dad would say, "Okay, let's go have lunch." And that was really one of the most memorable times of that period for me, because we would go up the old Liberty Buffet, up the street about a block or 2. And the Liberty Buffet was an old bar. In the middle, they had sliced beef and sausage, hot dogs, and homemade baked buns. The beef was sliced thin. I get a little drooly when I talk about it, but it was so good. The beef was very Chicago sliced thin and thickly layered, and all the condiments on it. And then the hot dogs were Chicago style, wonderful quality hot dogs. And we would have that. I'd have a malted milk, because the other end of the bar was a malted milk or soda fountain, real soda fountain, real malted milk, made with real ice cream. And on the other end was draft beer. Dad would have a draft beer, I'd have a malted milk, he'd have a beef sandwich, and I'd probably have a hot dog. And I still distinctly remember the taste of both of those. And as I've told some of the kids and the visitors to the Warhawk, that was a very memorable experience. It just branded itself into my head. It cost a nickel for each item. The malt was a nickel, the beer was a nickel, the sandwich was a nickel. And I just told these kids, you may have a $100 pair of Nikes on you, but I don't think you enjoy those as much as I did that hot dog and malted milk. So we came out of that, and into high school, we guys were pretty much into sports. I learned about girls a little later, and anyway, I went to college then, University of Nebraska. I graduated in 1942. But that childhood, to a lot of us of that age, that era, was important, I think, in what we sent onto the battlefields in that war which had to be fought and into the skies. I think it was very critical. I don't know how later generations would react to that same situation, but we were in that war 100%. Man, woman, child, whatever.
Now, Chet, as you were going through college, were you aware of what was going on in Europe? How much aware were you?
I like that question, because we were following the war in Europe very closely. And like the Dunkirk evacuation of the British at Dunkirk and a few French, 1940. That was June of 1940, and we followed that closely. Of course, we had the announcement. I'll interject this. December 7, 1941, I was a Phi Psi, fraternity Phi Kappa Psi, University of Nebraska. We were all standing around the Majestic, and Roosevelt's speech came through that we were officially at war with Japan and Germany. And we followed the events very closely, because after that announcement, my college days changed quite a bit. We concentrated more on girls and beer than we did scholastics. And there was always somebody going away. It seemed like every other day a guy was going to join the Marines or the Army Air Corps or the Navy or the Army or the Coast Guard. They were leaving right and left. And we'd always go out to Freddie's Tea Room, which was a nice little beer hall north of the campus in Lincoln, where they had popcorn, peanuts, and draft Schmidt City Club. And we all had a party for every guy that left, in our immediate acquaintance. And we enjoyed it. We had songs, we had stories. It was a pretty adventurous and glamorous time in history. If you can see a bunch of young guys out there singing, and pretty much gentlemen. There wasn't any profanity really, or any coarseness. We were young soldiers really in the making.
Did you feel pressured to leave college at that time, or were you determined to go on and graduate?
I'll tell you what, I would have. There was a chance way back I could have joined the RCAF, Royal Canadian Air Force, in 1941, like Jan Hamilton's father did. And I was driving tour buses in Glacier Park at that time. I drove Glacier Park big red buses 1941 and 1946. In 41, of course, everything was in full bloom in Europe and elsewhere. And I thought very seriously, but then my dad said, get your education under your belt. So I got an extension to June when I graduated in 1942. And so I finished, I got my degree, and immediately 4 days later I was in Fort Lewis, Washington, with the 87th Mountain Regiment as a volunteer, second lieutenant, infantry. The whole outfit was infantry. The whole outfit was volunteer. There were people from the Norwegian Royal Guard who had escaped the invasion of Norway by the Nazi. There were doctors, lawyers, there were engineers, there were ski instructors, there were mountain climbers, a fabulous group of men that made the 87th and 86th Mountain Regiments, which later became the 10th Mountain Division. But anyway, yes, I did extend my time. I don't know what would have happened if I'd have just broken it off right there in 41. And where I might have wound up, very hard to say. But the fortunes of war developed, pretty well dictated what happened.
So you found yourself in Fort Lewis, and was that of your choosing, or was it pretty much predetermined that you were going to go there?
All volunteer.
I see.
Every man there was volunteer at the time. It was going to be paraski troops. You could envision that what they thought, we'd be dropped in Europe, in the Alps, or some mountainous area. And because Russia had a pretty big ski troop development, and the Germans certainly had a winter operation, mountain operation, we thought there'd be a lot of fighting in the mountains, which were natural barriers. So anyway, I was with the 87th Regiment until January of 1943, at which time I transferred to the U.S. Army Air Corps for pilot training.
Okay, and where were you at that time?
I was in Camp Hill, Colorado, loving the ski training, and up in the high mountains of Leadville, enjoying the outfit. And the reason I transferred is because the previous fall, just a few months earlier, they had advertised or sent a bulletin around that they were desperately in need of pilots, and that anybody could transfer in grade if they could pass the physical. And about 15 of us said, well, we're testing jungle boots one day and we're in snow boots the next, and we're never going to get into this war, shaken with patriotism, And so I put in my application along with 15 others. Well, by the time we got to Hale, the orders came through. 8 of us made it. And the reason they wanted pilots was because, if you recall, in late 42, the 8th Air Force in its origin had about a couple of 300 planes they could launch on a raid on the French coast or maybe into Germany. But the problem was their only escort were Spitfires, which would take them into the coast of France a little ways before they had to turn back for fuel reasons. So the Luftwaffe picked them up from the coast of France all the way to the target and back, and the losses were so extreme they were losing 20, 30, 50% of their command every time. In fact, in October of 43, my group, the 100th Bomb Group at Thorpe Abbotts in East Anglia, sent out 18 aircraft group, and only one came back from Munster. The rest of them were either shot down over the target or on the way, or had ditched in the channel or had landed at an emergency airfield. So with those kind of losses, they were pretty desperate for aircraft and airplanes. Mm-hmm. And they were starting to turn out B-17s in great quantity and B-24s.
Did you know anything about flying or aircraft at that time?
Yes. Back in the heyday of the Bowers, when we had the big brick house, my dad had a part interest in 2 aircraft, an old Curtiss Robin and a Great Lakes Sport Trainer. And I got to fly in those things when I was a kid before the Depression. And I've always been fascinated by flying. A lot of flatlanders, Kansas, Iowa, Nebraska. Lindbergh, you know, spent a lot of time in Nebraska. And it seems like the flatlanders seem to love flying. I guess it's because they couldn't climb any mountains. And so I had an interest, yes.
So you're in Colorado, you volunteer for the Army Air Corps, and where did you go from there?
They sent me to Santa Ana pre-flight school. And we had there were, as I remember, in our section, there were 5 officers, 2nd lieutenants, 1 first lieutenant. 2 of them come off Guadalcanal and were combat veterans. The other 3 of us had been stateside. But there was always a little resentment on the part of the Army Air Corps instructors. Here they were a guy that outranked them, and they were teaching us how to fly. So there was a little friction there a couple of places, but the most fun I ever had flying was with an old guy, Albert Weir, who was a preacher in Lompoc, California. And we were at Santa Maria for primary in a beautiful PT-17, the Boeing Stearman, which was the most marvelous airplane I've ever flown. He would take us up and fly upside down on our first flight, just hanging there by the belt, and we'd say, oh man, I don't know if I signed up for the right outfit or not. But he'd get us totally familiar with that thing, and then taught us aerobatics. And that airplane was probably the best aerobatic airplane in the air at that time. But I have fond memories of that. Then we went on to Bakersfield for BT-13, the Vultee vibrator training. And finally I went to advanced flying school in Yuma, where I had an RAF instructor, incidentally. I'll never forget those guys. They were great pilots, great instructors. And they're just like a bunch of ducks. We'd be in our AT-6s, and he'd take the 5 of us up, and he'd lead, and we'd go up to those big old cumulus clouds around Yuma, horrible place. I got to tell you about Yuma. We got moved into there from Bakersfield, where it was only 100 degrees. We got down to Yuma, it was about 120, August. It was so dry, and the streets were covered with these damn crickets, these big black crickets. You could have spread cornflakes down on the street, and it made the same sound when you walked on the sidewalk. Crunch, crunch. And we said, boy, this is a pretty dry, hot place. And there was an old codger sitting on the hotel porch in a rocking chair, and I said, say, old friend, where can we get a beer around here? He said, son, Patton's Army has been up here for the last 6 weeks training at Indio, or in the desert between here and there. He says, those guys had a 3-day pass into Yuma, and they just left town. There isn't a beer in this whole county. We got a kick out of that, but Yuma was kind of as our RAF instructor said, a ghastly place. We'd get on those old bamboo bombers, a C-78 Cessna, which had nose sections of wood and canvas. Actually, they melted out. A lot of times they'd pull them in for maintenance and have to glue them back together. Those miserable old Jacobs engines would drip more oil than they used. And we'd go up to 10,000 feet to get comfortable. It would cool off. But there are a lot of stories about Yuma, but I just soon forget them. But anyway, we came out of flying school.
So after Yuma, then where were you sent?
We were given 2 choices, and I have to say this. Here we were instrument, the 5 guys in my section. And we were trained in infantry tactics. We knew what an infantry division was, a regiment was, a company and a squad, and what their modus operation was in battle. And I thought, we are the guys who should fly ground support for our friends in the infantry. And as it happened, this thing I described before, the loss of the 8th Air Force was so severe, we came out of there the best ground-to-air, air-to-ground gunnery class they ever had. Boy, we could really shatter those targets on the ground. And they said, you got two choices. You can stay in training command, or you can go over as heavy co-pilots. Well, we were disappointed in that particular part of the war, and said, well, most of us said, well, hell, we'll just take our chances to go overseas as co-pilots. Maybe do a second tour or get into something else. So I was assigned a crew, and we met first at Ephrata, Washington, and got acquainted and did a little flying there. Then we went to Ardmore, Oklahoma, not a favorite place of my dreams. And with the crew, flew practice missions, shooting landings and takeoffs and a lot of stuff like that. We lost a few crews down there. There were some hills in the vicinity, and some guys didn't quite keep their approach altitude long enough. And from there, we were given a short leave, and we went to Kearney, Nebraska to pick up a brand new B-17, pure, brand new, shiny aluminum. They'd figured at that point that the 8th Air Force, with their OD drab, Army drab, really wasn't too practical. It took a little airspeed away, it added a little weight, and the Germans knew from the minute we took off that the 8th Air Force was in the air, and by the time we crossed the channel, they had a pretty good idea where we were going, in addition to their intelligence, which was pretty efficient. I'll tell you a story about that one later, but we picked up this new B-17 at Kearney and flew across the Atlantic via Manchester, New Hampshire, Goose Bay, Nutts Corner, Ireland, and finally a base outside of London. We left the airplane.
Chet, at that point, had your crew formed up, or were you still just going over there to form up?
Oh, we were a 10-man crew. We were all set.
Okay.
And we'd been flying together probably for a couple of months. And through Ardmore, and then picked the airplane up at Kearney. They went overseas. So we dropped that brand new airplane, and when we were assigned to our group, we got an old Fool's Rush in, which lasted for 3 crews. We were the second, the third one went down. But the trip across the Atlantic was kind of notable. Here we were 150 to 160 or maybe 170 miles an hour, depending on the winds, and it seemed like forever. And Greiner, Pete Greiner, one of the best pilots that ever lived, he's dead. He was a fine man, a gentleman, and really knew how to fly that B-17. We'd take turns flying, and we had an autopilot. And the little bombardier, he wasn't little, George was average height, but he was 19 years old. He was from Rochester, New York. And he and the navigator would be up in the nose, and Greiner and I'd say, okay, you take it for an hour or two. Let the guy doze off. Well, George would stick his head up in the Astrodome, and when we looked back and he saw both pilots, heads slumped over, sound asleep. And he'd run up there and he'd say, what are you trying to do, kill us before we get there? And he was quite a kick. So we got overseas, we got to England. We had a pretty extensive ground school, what to expect, taught by these guys who had survived 25 missions across the channel. In those days, it was kind of a rarity. The chances were about 25, 30, 35%. But we had a good ground school, and then we flew formation practices. Oh, just everlasting. 2 and 3 hour missions over England, flying formation, to keep it tucked in, because right at that point, the B-17 was supposed to be the flying fortress that could defend itself against any comers. And they had the formations figured so that a group was staggered with a 6 aircraft squadron here, a 6th one here, and 6 here, which gave fields of fire with the 50 calibers were supposed to be make us almost invincible. Well, the Luftwaffe proved that was incorrect right off the bat. But we, I forgot where we were.
Well, you were doing practice.
Oh, yeah, the practice missions. And we finally got done, and on March 14, 15, we made our first combat mission with the 100th Bomb Group. And we went to a target fairly deep in Germany. And at that time, I think we had about 500, 600 B-17s and B-24s in the air. So it was pretty impressive to see this string of aircraft leaving contrails as far as you could see ahead of you and as far as you could see behind you. A real air armada, and that's why it was the greatest air war that ever was. But we went into this target in Germany, and we were about 3 or 4 hours out and probably an hour short of the target. And the ME-109s came in and pulled the fighter escort. The ME-109s pulled our fighter escort away, which at that time were basically P-47s, early, in 44. And then the Focke-Wulfs came in to hit the bombers. The Focke-Wulf was like our A-10 was a tank killer. The Focke-Wulf was the bomber killer. And it was heavily armed, armor plated, and also had a cannon, several cannon firing. And they were devastating. If they got into the formation, boy, you could figure you're going to lose somebody. And the group ahead of us that day on our first mission got hit. And they were above us slightly and to the right. Well, we witnessed aircraft, a couple of them exploding in the air, another couple with the wing gone or something. Anyway, they go into a dead man spiral. And those you'd sometimes see some chutes come out of. Of course, the ones that exploded, if the guy had his chute on, concussion might open his chute or something like that. But the dead man spiral was pretty heavy centrifuge, and it nailed people to the wall pretty good. The tail didn't have much of a chance, and the waist gunners could get out. The guys in the flight deck, not much chance. Besides that, you couldn't get out the windows. You had to go back to the bomb bay or down through the bombardier navigator hatch. But witnessing that happen that day, I think we went home and wrote more letters home than we probably ever did before or after. We figured this war was a pretty bloody business. To see, you know, 6 or 8 aircraft, we could see pieces of airplane go by, tables, chairs, papers, parachutes, all that stuff. It was sort of like a big movie, only it wasn't a movie.
At that time, the P-47s were escorting you to the target. Did they have to pull off before you got to the target?
No. They had belly tanks, and they could stay all the way. And they did a pretty good job. Zaberski got, I don't know how many kills he got, but he was the first ace in a P-47. P-38s were no match for the Luftwaffe. They were pretty, they looked pretty, they sounded good, but they could not match an ME-109. And so when the P-51 came along, late in my tour, that's the one that saved our bacon. Because the P-51 would outperform the ME-109. So would the Spitfire, really, in performance. But the Spits didn't have the gas range. And anyway, I swear at that point, it looked like every kid that graduated from high school in the United States got a new P-51, and he was over in Europe. And thank the Lord for it, because we did overwhelm them. But the P-51 really saved the bombers' bacon. And the other things that saved our bacon early on that I didn't talk about. I started to talk about the evacuation at Dunkirk in 1940. Mm-hmm. The Brits got all their boats together, as you two know, the Hale sailboats, freighters, Navy ships, everything, and they evacuated some 229,000 guys off that beach and got them back to England where they could fight again. But that was the time when Goering and a guy named General, I can't remember, on Hitler's staff, the general on Hitler's staff advocated going right away, launching a seaborne and airborne invasion of England. And if you think about that for a minute, the Brits were pretty weak. The Home Guard was there, but the 8th Army was in Egypt, and they were scattered all over the world. And it was only 20 miles of channel across there. And if they had pursued this course on the advice, and even Goering decided that that was a pretty good idea. But Hitler rejected it. He wanted to maintain, for some reason, he wanted to maintain some relationship with the Brit government because he figured he would deal with them in the future on his terms. Anyway, 2 things happened. Dunkirk, the evacuation, the fact that Hitler's decision was bad, and then there was the Battle of Britain, where the RAF, very few bunch of kids from colleges around there with their flying clubs who were placed into Spitfires and Hurricanes, and these kids took on tremendous odds when the Luftwaffe came over day and night, bombing not just military targets, but bombing whole cities, whether it was London, Coventry, or wherever it was. And they were flying 6 and 7 sorties a day or night. And I have heard firsthand stories that they'd come down, refuel, load up ammunition, and back up to 20 or 30,000, 25,000 feet. And they would fly so often that finally they'd land, and maybe there was the particular battle was over, and they just taxi off the runway and fall asleep right in the cockpit. But that was a remarkable thing, and that's, of course, where Winston Churchill said, never have so many owed so much to so few. It certainly was in reference to that small RAF at the time, which was growing leaps and bounds in the factories and in the trained pilots. So there were 3 things that could have changed the course of the war. We would have a totally different business partner in Europe. I don't think Hitler would ever have thought of coming over and commandeering our country, but we would have certainly had a different situation in Europe.
Now, you were based in southeast England.
Yeah.
And you flew all your missions out of there.
Right.
And typically they were to targets in Germany and other points?
Everywhere from Calais, especially when the secret weapons started coming up. Peenemünde was the birthplace of the V2.
The V2?
The P2, V2.
The V1 and the
V1.
V2.
V1 and the V2. Yeah. The V2 was we call it the flying bathtub. They'd launch it from Germany and it'd make a big arc like a mortar shell and land somewhere in Britain. Nobody knew just where. The same was true of the V1, which was the putt-putt, the little pulse jet that was launched off a platform and flew at low altitude. And those things came over, and the RAF was getting pretty good at getting under them and tipping a wingtip while they're over the channel. But they did land indiscriminately anywhere, killing Brits. And it was a kind of a terror weapon, the first of the terror weapons, because you didn't know where the thing was going to come down. If you could see it, you're in danger of some kind. But anyway, we had those targets on the coast when they developed them, when Hitler developed them. And then we'd go deep into Leipzig and Berlin, and we'd go, 6, 8, 9, 10-hour missions. And I always resented those guys in the P-51s. They'd come up, they'd jump in our beautiful machine and zip over there, and they'd spend 2 hours with us, giving us fighter cover against the Luftwaffe. And they'd go back and drink coffee and sit around the Nissen hut. And the next wing had come up past them on the way out, and they'd pick us up for a couple hours. While we were sitting there in that damn truck full of explosives, and no wonder we all had hemorrhoids or whatever, but anyway, it was a long, cold session. And relieving yourself up in those conditions was kind of a major project. You had to go about 3 layers of clothing. You had to first get out of your seat and get back to bomb bay, and then go about your business, because there was a pitot tube back there, and if you missed it, it froze instantly. And on one occasion, we had a portable oxygen bottle you had to strap on to get back there. Coming back, I busted the connection in the bomb bay, and I didn't realize it. And I was sinking to my knees, and Greiner looked around and saw me going down, and he alerted the top turret, Jack Pogue, to get down there and hook me up again quick, and otherwise I wouldn't be here for this interview. But there were things like that, and it was just endless. And then, of course, there were very exciting times. Flak was our biggest enemy, because the Luftwaffe, for reasons of top command, hadn't pursued the development of the Me-262, the German jet. If they had had that in wide production, again, the war would have had a different outcome because they would have ruled the skies over Europe and England. It's pure and simple. That airplane would, of course, was fast and had a terrific armament. And anyway, we went along through the flak, and the coastal flak always seemed severe. And then, of course, over Berlin, the comment was made early on that it looked like heavy overcast. They said the flak was so thick you could ride a bicycle on it. And when you got into places like that where I don't know how many batteries of German 88s were there, they were in batteries of 4, they must have had thousands of guns. And they took their toll. They might get one group for a couple of airplanes. They might miss one group entirely, but they'd get a couple out of the next, or 3. And they were uncannily accurate. I remember watching on a few clear days, you could look ahead at an angle about 20 degrees and see little pinpoint flashes. And then it took a few seconds and whoomp, 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 and 4 shells would burst in your vicinity. And it was so thick and occasionally the airplane actually was in rough air, you'd get spanked and holes. And you're lucky you didn't get one in the wing or with a direct burst because they were proximity fuses. They were set for altitude. And they were very sophisticated in their radar. And their gun, 88, was probably the best gun of the war. But the spanking of flak was so severe. One day over the coast of France, our waist gunners, Red McDaniel and Chuck. Anyway, Chuck and Red were in our waist positions, and the flak was just thick. And we were getting spanked, and Red said to Chuck, he says, "Chuck, I wish I were a little bitty baby just being born, and a girl baby at that." Anyway, anything to get him out of his present situation.
Did you sustain much damage? Did you have to nurse any aircraft home?
Yes, a couple of times, but we got quite. You got shot at almost every time out. There were flak batteries so mobile that you never knew really where they were, in spite of our briefing. And so flak was our biggest enemy, but we did have a fighter attack on the way into Munich, I believe it was. And here was a string. This was mid-44, probably May of 44. And we had a fighter attack with FW-190s. And they knocked out our inboard starboard engine, and we lost a supercharger on another engine. So we couldn't stick with the string, and here we were surrounded by aircraft, flying tight formation, reasonably tight, which is a chore in itself. That's why they had 2 pilots. You couldn't do that for very long. And anyway, we dropped out of the formation. We lost our airspeed, and we had to lose our altitude. Pretty soon, I'd never seen such a lonely sky in my life. There wasn't anything visible for any direction. And the bomber string had gone on. We were out there. The navigator was taking us back to England, and it was an undercast. And we had several flak batteries. They kept banging away at us, and we were afraid. I was for shooting green flares, which called for fighter support. And Groener said, maybe we better not. Might get the wrong Air Force. And so we went along, holding about 10,000 feet. And pretty soon we saw 2 specks in the distance. Well, if they were FW-190s, we figured we'd bought the farm, or we could drop our gear indicating surrender, and they'd take us into some airfield there. But they turned out to be P-47s. They did beautiful figure S's over us all the way to the coast, and we made it into an emergency airstrip on the coast, an RAF airstrip, which must have been, a quarter-mile wide and 3 miles long. And after looking around, after we got down, we didn't have hydraulics. We got the gear down manually, and we had no flaps. So we just rolled to a stop and had quite a few holes in the airplane. And I got looking around, and boy, it looked like a graveyard. anything from 1938 or 39 on. RAF that had come over there had made emergency stops because they just barely made it across the channel. It could have been a Blenheim, it could have been a Hampton, it could have been Lancaster, Halifax, Spitfire, Hurricane, whatever it was. They landed there, and if they were serviceable, they fixed them. If they didn't, they had 3 big bulldozers. And they just plowed them off to the side. There was every describable type of airplane in heaps around that airstrip. But a day or two later, we got back to base, fixed up, and on our way again. Of course, the Brits, bless them, they got us off the airplane, gave us a tot of rum right first off, and they treated us very well.
Now, Chet, do you have some pictures of your crew and airplane?
Yeah, I just happened to have their good old black and whites. I wish I'd had the cameras we have today over there. I'd have done a lot better job. But this is a picture of the crew. This is Pete Greiner, pilot, and that's George Lewis, navigator. He's gone. And Jack Pogue, top turret. That's me right here, co-pilot. We took it in front of a different airplane than our regular aircraft was Fool's Rush In. And well, here's Fool's Rush In, a rather modest nose art here. I certainly could have done better, but that was done by the first crew, and I claim no knowledge of it. We just accepted it as it was. This is me in probably one of the first flak suits that ever hit the United Kingdom. They were pretty heavy, and they were good protection. But we discovered one day on takeoff that they were also hazardous to your health. The bombardier and navigator, being up in their glass cage, had taken the liberty of getting 4 or 5 of these flak aprons and lined the bottom of their cubicle up there with the thought that if any flak came through, they were at least going to have a little layer of protection. Well, the airplane took off like a wounded goose, and the Greiner finally, we found out what it was. So we got rid of that. The flak suits did earn their way. That's another crew picture here, but same one. This is sort of graphic, and this is what it looked like if you're in a lower group or wherever. That's a bunch of B-17s. Contrails got so thick it was almost like cloud cover. And if you can imagine, as far as you can see, front, rear, aircraft all over the skies. And this is sort of a shot of 17s under fire by flak. And that isn't particularly thick flak. The flak that I'd call thick is when you get 4 bursts within, 100 yards of or 50 yards of your aircraft. And bursts, these are isolated bursts, really. When you got over London or Berlin or Leipzig, it was just so thick it was unbelievable. They had unbelievable stores of flak, ammunition, and those guns were certainly excellent. But that's, there's another picture of the crew, that's the same. Anyway, the action was there was always a high pucker factor at takeoff. A cold, wet morning in England is a cold, wet, dark morning. We were briefed probably anywhere from 2 to 5 o'clock or 6 on a late mission, a short mission. And out of the briefing room and into the night, and the 2.5-ton trucks out to the hard stand where the B-17s were. And we'd get in and take off, and there was such close proximity, aerodrome to aerodrome, that if the wind was right, we had crossing takeoff patterns. And that was really a high pucker factor thing, because every once in a while you'd see a big bright orange flash or yellow flash, and you knew 2 of them would run into each other. And 20 guys down the tube. One of those mornings, I'd like to just elaborate a little bit. Our crew chief, Ed Seidel, was a Texan, and he used to knock off a pheasant every once in a while with his carbine. And he and the crew, ground crew, would be out there enjoying roast fried pheasant. And they'd always have some for us. We got a wing or a leg or something. And we'd be sitting there waiting to get in the airplane. And Calais Mary would come on. And she was sort of like Axis Sally. Well, then Calais Mary was broadcasting to all the troops in England. And she said, "Good morning, Yanks. Hope you enjoyed our serenade." Well, she had beautiful Glenn Miller stuff. Oh, Tuxedo Junction, you know, String of Pearls, all the wonderful music that came out of Miller's band. And she said, "I hate to interrupt, but we do know where you're going today, and we wish you well, but note from yesterday's raid, several of your aircraft were shot down, and as you know, the Luftwaffe or the Wehrmacht will always try to capture or get your men and take them to a stalag. Yesterday, unfortunately, a lot of the local farmers got to your men first, and they pitchforked them to death. And have a good day." Anyway, there were things like that, very memorable. And I think I enjoyed England. A lot of troops didn't enjoy England, but we were certainly treated well. And I bought a Churchill over under 12 gauge shotgun, because our waist gunner from Louisiana had said, "Lieutenant, you got to see that gun. I'd get it, but I can't afford it." And I went down to London Bond Street on my next pass, and I looked at it, and I fell in love with it. And I borrowed from the crew, and with 3 trips down there, I finally bought the gun. Well, I used to hunt the king's pheasant and partridge over there, and I knew every farmer around the base. I'd take them chocolate, I'd take them shot shells. I sure when it was silk stockings, it was a girl hammer in there. But anyway, canned soap. The Brits were living in such an austere condition that we Americans just can't understand it. Besides being shot, bombed, shelled, and having literally nothing, meat was almost a precious commodity. Scotch was even tight. But anyway, they had tough times that we didn't even think of. And anyway, they appreciated these little things I brought them. So I had several places I could just take my dog. I raised a dog over there. I've never been without one. The Deacon was an English field cocker. As a result of our visits to Harleston, 6 miles from the base, we'd bicycle our English issue bikes to Harleston, and we'd go down and drink beer and shoot darts with the locals. And I got to know this one old boy, George Spratt. He looked like John Bull himself. Red face, ruddy, blocky. He was the town butcher. And we got talking dogs and shooting darts, and he said, "Chester, you've got to come down and see this litter that my dog Edward has sired." And Edward was a pure rust, like Irish setter rust, and a good-sized cocker, field cocker they call him. Well, 6, 7 weeks later, he says, "Do you want one of those dogs?" And I said, "Yes." So I pedaled the Deacon. He had a white strip right down his chest. I pedaled him home from Harleston to the base, and he was raised on GI rations. There was no dog food around. He ate what we did, and he became, because when I was flying missions, another crew would take care of him. And finally, he got to know the mess sergeant pretty well. And you'd see Deacon riding around the base in the right-hand seat of the mess sergeant's Jeep, and you can bet he was eating as well as any of us. And he was such a popular dog with the group that one of the enlisted men gave him away to his dear girlfriend in Norwich. And another guy says, "Lieutenant, I think I know where your dog is." And I said, "Let's go." So we got a Jeep and we went up Norwich. And here in this fenced backyard was old Deacon. We just reached over and plucked him out and back to base, where he was very happy. And so I had a hunting dog and I had a shotgun. And I had the permission of a lot of good English farmers over there to hunt on their land. So we did pretty well. There was that aspect of the war. And I later joined the wing headquarters. I'll tell you about the Deacon again. General Gerhardt was my wing commander. Was a wing commander. And he had General Partridge invited him down to go bird hunting, because this captain we got here has a bird dog and knows where to go. So here I was, General Partridge and General Gerhardt. Partridge was a 4-star, Gerhardt was a 3-star. So I got the old Deacon out and said, "Boy, we got a special assignment." Well, we were out on the airdrome. It stood down, and there were birds on the airdrome too. The dog must have been rank happy. He flushed birds 100 yards any direction. I don't think anybody got a shot. And Gerhardt looked at me and said, I thought that was a trained bird dog. Ours, I never forgot it. Oh, terrible embarrassment. I think the deacon was rank conscious. He knew big time. He was doing big things.
Well,
But
sounds like you made the best of your off time.
oh yeah, yeah. And we got passes to London occasionally, which I really didn't go much for. The buzz bomb started my first pass down there, and I was dancing with some lovely gal up in the top of the Mayfair, and the buzz bomb started, and a few exploded nearby, but I don't think anybody went downstairs. I kept on dancing. And then my favorite leave place was Scotland, Aberdeen. Go up there, and there was an RAF squadron up there, and they always had a barrel of scotch in the basement, and they'd fish the River Dee or whatever, and they always had a big salmon, which they had cooked, and it was quite an interesting experience. They were pretty wild. I mean, not just the Scotch, but they were kind of bored. They'd been through the Battle of Britain, and they'd go across this grass airstrip at Aberdeen, and they'd see who could cut turf with his prop. And they were doing aerobatics in the pattern. The guys up in the control tower were just going nuts trying to control them. There was no controlling them. We flew a B-17 up there once, 4 of us, on a 3-day pass. We weren't supposed to go there. And they'd cover our aircraft with camouflage because they knew we were off limits. And they'd come up and see us coming. They'd get up there and they'd tap wingtips. Crazy bunch of buggers, really.
Chet, in all, how many bombing missions did you go on?
Wound up 35.
35.
Started 25 when we had not much fighter support. And the odds were then, you know, if a crew finished 5 missions, it looked good for them. Their odds were up. But like so many, our friend here that has his story on the wall, POW, he went down on his 3rd mission. And it seemed like that was sort of a pattern. If you made it through 5, you were doing pretty well. As our fighter support picked up and the P-51s came on, it increased, so they increased our missions to 30, and then they went to 35. That had a kind of a psychological effect on a lot of crewmen, because they figured each time that did, the odds went the other direction pretty bad.
Mm-hmm. So you got to the end of your 35th mission. What was the date now by this time?
That was D-Day, just shortly after D-Day. Yeah.
Okay. And pretty much had all fighter attacks disappeared on you?
On D-Day, I guess there were 2 Luftwaffe Me-109s in the air, and they didn't do anything really. There was no flak, because evidently all the 88s had been tilted down toward the invasion forces. So really, all we could do is look down occasionally through those clouds and look at that miserable sea and look at those poor buggers down there doing probably the most heroic thing since the Civil War as far as charging the enemy position. To me, that was unbelievable heroism.
Your mission was to bomb behind the lines?
We did, and one group fell short, and unfortunately, on probably a smoke signal that drifted back over American lines, and it killed General McNair and many of his men. But that was the only mistake that day, and it was awful. We flew twice that day. So friendly fire takes its toll, but I think the Germans are so good at digging in now. Boy.
What did it look like flying over the Normandy beach? Were there ships as far as you could see?
Every time we got a hold to the clouds, you could see little white wakes and a choppy sea. And yes, every place you looked, you could see through, there were ships. And all kinds of ships. I really couldn't get a clear view of the beaches.
Was that your last mission, you said?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Right.
And then you came back, and
I
what
stayed
happened?
over. The rest of the crew came back, except Pete Greiner stayed to check out a new crew with the 100th Group, and he had the terrible misfortune. He was just off the French coast, and an Me-262 picked him off. They lost 3 guys on the initial shootout, and then they ditched, and Pete made it. The Luftwaffe picked them up instead of the RAF Air Sea Rescue. And he spent a year in a Stalag also. And but here he was checking out a new crew, his last flight. He would have headed for the States. But I went to a wing headquarters, and anyway, I worked there as a controller, thinking I might fly another mission, although I'd certainly have picked fighters, and or P-47s on the ground. And anyway, I came back to States in July of '45, and was discharged in December of 1945, and I drove tour buses to get my head screwed on again right in '46, and then I went to work for the Mountain States Tell and Tell Company in Montana, and wonderful place. I still consider it my favorite spot. Fishing, hunting, fly fishing, and bird shooting, and river running, and all that stuff. And from then on, I was with various corporations.
Chet, could we go and look at some of the items that you've donated to the museum?
Fine with me, if you have the time.
Thank you. Well, Chet, we're at your display case here at the Warhawk Air Museum. Maybe you'd like to take us through a few of the items you have in here.
With pleasure. And some fond memories. This is the early part of my military adventure. June of '42, I joined the 87th Mountain Infantry Regiment as a volunteer second lieutenant at Fort Lewis, Washington. And this is part of the training the mountain infantry went through. We learned to climb, we learned to test all kinds of mountaineering equipment, and each battalion had one Jeep, and that was for the colonel or the major. The rest of us had 40 pounds of rucksack, and there was always the mule component, which was the heavy weapons part of our outfit. I was second platoon leader. The first platoon was point. They were out to engage first. The next unit was heavy weapons, and here were the mules. I became personally acquainted with many of these mules as I was second platoon leader, and I stared at mules' rumps for hundreds and hundreds of miles around the Puget Sound. And they were treated like royalty. In fact, in their big corral, the sign said, "Through these portals pass the most beautiful mules in the world." And they were big old GI mules, huge. And anyway, that was our first part. I dearly loved that outfit. They were a great bunch of soldiers. Then came the Army Air Corps.
Some of these items down here, is that your flying helmet and your oxygen mask?
That is my flying helmet that happens to be issued, we got our choice RAF helmets, which were goatskin, beautiful stuff, chamois, as against the GI, which was split sheep and not as comfortable. So that's my helmet and oxygen mask. I also have an old summer flying suit somewhere, but that's the extent. And then my log books are down here from primary in Santa Maria, and basic training in Bakersfield, California, and various other things. This painting by Keith Ferris is of our group, Square D on the tail, and that happens to have been made in March or April of 1944 during the time which I flew my combat tour. These are bomb strikes, if you can see them up here. Strike photos, and also a great picture of the release of 500-pounders, or those may be incendiaries, I don't know, down in that shot right there. And then bomb strikes on a day it was almost clear.
Okay. Well, Chet, I understand you have a poem written by one of your crew members. Would you like to share that with us?
Yes, I'd like to. This was written by our left waist gunner, Red McDaniel. He's gone. All but 4 of the crew are gone. But this piece of poetry is probably the best I've ever read about a crewman on one of these flying trucks, beautiful trucks, about his aircraft and the crew. And our crew each received one of these. I had it mounted and framed, and so everybody and our wives have got a copy of this. And if you would like me to read it, I'll go ahead. I sometimes get a little bit emotional down at the end, but I'll try control it. It's called Fools Rush In, which is the name of our B-17G. She's battle-scarred from nose to stern. At times her props too tired to turn. The guns are worn that are in the chin, fighting the life of fools rush in. The glass is scratched and not intact from the ever-pounding smoky flak, cutting the metal in strips so thin, destroying the beauty of fools rush in. The olive drab is beginning to fade, losing her color shade by shade. Of course her body is only tin, revealing the flesh of fools rush in. The dorsal fin that stands so well, carrying the scars of cannon shell, and above the waist that I am in, there's another hole in Fools Rush In. The Tokyo tanks are forever full. For the longest mission she always pulls. Poland, Brunswick, and Berlin, but she's always back, old Fools Rush In. Sometimes an engine or two we feather, but Skipper smiles and observes the weather. Touching the ground, they begin to spin, home once more, and Fools Rush In. Not one abortion to her name, has she. And so very proud of this are we. Why to break this record would be a sin and blacken the name of Fools Rush In. 40 and 10 is the total score, good for 100 or maybe more. 50 missions will only begin the adventurous life of Fools Rush In. Swastika stickers strewn all over the nose, dealing them death with mighty blows. Credit all claimed by the fighting men who fly the ship, the Fools Rush In. Old Fools Rush In. Skipper is tender and handles her mild, and at times you think she was only a child. He loves that girl as we have him who pilots us home in Fools Rush In. Oh God, let her see Germany fall. For many a day she's answered the call. Tokyo streets will see us then. The fighting life of Fools Rush In. That's by Sergeant R.L. McDaniel. Fools Rush In, B-17. That was written in March, about June of 1944.
Well, Chet, let's pick up on after the war. You came back, you moved to Montana, and I think you said you were working for Mountain States Telephone.
Correct.
What year was that?
That was 1947. That I went Mountain States Tel, and I was up there for 3 years. They transferred me as manager of Phoenix, and then they transferred me to El Paso. Anyway, I didn't last long in that country, and I separated from Mountain. I shouldn't have done it, but I did separate from the telephone company because I didn't like it there, and there were a couple other policy changes I didn't like. So I left there and joined W.R. Grace & Company and moved back to Denver, which I loved in those days. It was just a great city.
And what caused you to move to Idaho?
Well, I worked for W.R. Grace for a number of years, and then I decided Denver was too big for an old guy that likes to hunt and fish and ski. There were a couple of million people running around there, and I figured that's getting too heavy for me, so we moved to Idaho Falls. And as a result of my packaging experience with W.R. Grace, I became well acquainted with the potato industry, so I joined the spud industry as a sales manager for frozen potato products to institutional users across the United States. So I traveled for that outfit, and then it was Idaho Potato Growers in Idaho Falls. And then Ore-Ida hired me away from them in 1968, and we moved to Boise, Idaho, with then Heinz. Because Heinz bought Ore-Ida in 1968 and moved the headquarters for Ore-Ida. So anyway, and I've continued on the corporate track working. I worked for several outfits, but tried to start my own food brokerage once after Ore-Ida had sort of separated the old guard, anybody with the old gray hairs compared to the new MBAs from Pittsburgh. And anyway, I didn't last long at that, but I did find a niche flying for Eagle Aircraft Company. They made the crop duster. Joe Turtling provided the finances, and Dean Wilson provided the design and the aircraft, which was quite a wonderful machine, except that interest rates at that time were 21%, and the farmers were looking for something, the ag pilots were looking for something much cheaper. Anyway, I retired from that in 1985 and bought the company airplane, a Cessna 206, and started with something I always wanted to do, and that's aerial photography. So I flew aerial photography until just last year when I sold out to a friend and sold my interest in the airplane. And anyway, that was probably a career-ending blessing. That aerial photography I loved to do and was pretty good at it. And I retired from that, as I say, last year, but I am continuing to work in photography, surface stuff. But that's about covers it. I can't think of any other notable things that happened.
Well, we're very pleased to have you at the museum when you volunteer here, and I know you have your stuff to tell the kids about your experiences, and after they've come in to see you at the museum, they sometimes write you letters. Would you like to share any of those with us?
Yeah. It's probably the biggest dividend of, well, one of the biggest dividends of being active with the Warhawk Museum, which I'm very proud of my affiliation. But the thing that really brought home to me is when these high school kids and other grades come in groups of 3, 4, 5, or 6, and Kelly and Lily and Sue get them assigned to the various stations where we old geezers tell our story about World War II firsthand while we're still alive. And it gives great encouragement to me to see this generation of kids who I feel have a better founding in common sense and maturity than have the previous couple of generations, who I consider, you know, out of the latter-day hippie group, out of the 60s, and we're just finally wearing off that and coming back to kids who are so sincere and so interested, finally, in a history that's being told properly instead of some of this modified stuff they're taught in schools, even these days. But these kids show promise. They're interested. They're real people, and I think they have bright futures. And it's always a kick to present to them and see the reactions. You'll get an occasional ho-hummer, and you wonder what he does at home too, or her. But it's amazing to me also how many of these young gals have aspirations in the medical field, and then lawyers and professionals and healthcare. And some of them are just, they're going to be exceptional folks, great contributors to this society. This is a letter I received from one of the kids, I've forgotten which school, but she was so unusual in her interest. And I can read this to you if you'd like. Dear Mr. Bowers, it was such a privilege for me to come and listen as you shared your World War II experiences. I just wish that I could have stayed longer and asked more questions. A man like yourself undoubtedly has countless stories to tell and great tidbits of wisdom to share. When we gathered in our class to share stories about our veterans, I probably went on the longest. I just could not help it. There were too many great stories to share with them. I think everyone was impressed that you knew the Memphis Belle pilot and that your flight team was the first to spot a German jet. Still, I personally think that just flying 35 missions on a B-17 is pretty impressive. I gathered a lot from listening to you. It was awesome to hear a first-person version of the World War II. My grandfather was in World War II, but he never talks about it because it brings back such sad memories for him. I cannot say that I blame him at all. However, I admire you and the fellow veterans that took your time to come out and pass on your experiences to another generation. Yeah, we're a bunch of rambunctious teenagers, I'm sure you recall those days, but I think each of us desires to have a connection with someone like you who is a hero and is such a vital part of our American heritage. I hope you'll continue to share with teenagers your inspiring life story. You may not think it is much, but it meant a lot to me, and I'm sure it has been meaningful to others. Your story will live on because you shared it with us. Thank you again for coming to give some teenagers a little insight into the life of a World War II veteran. Sincerely, Stacy Sanderson. P.S. As an aspiring physician, maybe I will be your doctor one day. Then again, you're in such good health, maybe I won't. Keep hunting those pheasants. They're probably the best medicine you can get. Isn't she a sweetheart?
Very nice. Chet, could we go back just to your military career a moment? What about reunions? Do you attend any reunions?
We had, quite a while ago, a Long Beach, California reunion of the 100th Group, and there were quite a few attended. A lot of them are gone now. But then we had another reunion in 1990 in which we went back to the old aerodrome in England, Thorpe Abbotts, 12 miles south of Norwich. And it was touching to us. We went to the air base, and the old little English church is still on a corner off the base, all stone, hundreds of years old. And there's part of the runway left, and the Brits have preserved the area around the control tower, and they've made it into a museum for the 100th Bomb Group. Because a lot of those farmers became very attached. We kept them awake morning and night, the rumble of a whole bunch of B-17s, and they went through, you know, not a very pleasant experience, and they still really had great respect and love for us, as much as their own RAF boys. But anyway, they've preserved that memorial at that control tower, and it's quite an experience. We went over in 1990, and there were 25 of us. I was only one of 3 air crew. The rest were ground crew, and we went into Norwich and stayed at the Norwich Hotel on the breakfast, or something beyond description. All kinds of fruits and kippers and all that stuff, and terrific pastries and porridge. Great big bowl of porridge, and it's delightful. And you eat that, it's enough, but you keep eating the kippers and the bacon and the ham and the homemade pastries. That was just a fabulous place. You didn't eat again all day long. You didn't need to. And we went to the farmer's market there at Norwich, which is a real kick. Bought myself a good old English tweed cap, which I love. Anyway, those were great experiences. And then they took us into Duxford, which is the old RAF fighter base. And there we witnessed probably the best air show I'll ever see, I have seen, or will ever see again. The RAF put on a show. They had ME-109s, they had Spitfires, they had Hurricanes, they had B-17, they had Lancasters, they had Halifax, and everything but a German FW-190. And I don't know if there are any left in the world or not. But they put on an air show showing an attack with simulated firing guns and everything, and aerobatics, and it was fantastic. And a bunch of English kids with their school caps on were there to greet us, and they just became good, close little buddies. They were just little guys, and they asked us what it was like and everything, and it was a heartwarming thing. And then the museum, of course, has every kind of aircraft you can imagine, but primarily based on World War II. That was an enjoyable experience.
Great. Well, Chet, I want to thank you very much for sharing your reminiscences today with us. It's been a real privilege and an honor. Thank you very much. I
feel good about it. You know, you never really get a chance to put it all together, and you remember something and you tell some kid this and that. And I welcome the opportunity to do it as a matter of record for my own family, for one thing. And certainly we hope it enlightens people 50 years from now. Thank you.
Sometimes I wonder why I spend the lonely night dreaming of a song. The melody haunts my reverie, and I am once again with you. When our love was new, and each kiss an inspiration. Ah, but that was long ago, and now my consolation is in the stardust of a song beside a garden wall. When stars are bright, you are in my arms. The nightingale tells his fairy tale of paradise where roses grow. Though I dream in vain, ever in my heart it